It's a question that everybody asks. How is it possible that Yaakov Avinu, the great tzaddik, the choicest of the Avos, would have lived his best years in such a horrible place as Mitzrayim? And we do have to wonder why the Torah makes a point of telling us exactly how many years that was, as if we couldn't work it out on our own. Most intriguing, of course, is that the parasha starts without a fresh paragraph, which raises the question why. The Medrash offers three possible reasons. Rashi only speaks about two of them, which tells us that Rashi believes, according to the Pshat, simple understanding of the Psukim, it's because of something to do with the theme of the entire parasha, which is effectively the theme of Yaakov's passing, that we don't have a fresh paragraph at the beginning. So we have to explore what is so unique about Yaakov's passing, about his last years in Mitzrayim, and how can you call a parasha which speaks about him leaving this world the parasha of Vayechi, when he lived. Vayechi Yaakov eretz Mitzrayim shevayis shana. The pasuk tells us that Yaakov lived in Mitzrayim for 17 years, and it says Vayimei Yaakov gom, and this was the total extent of his life. Fragments. There's a simple question. Why does the Torah have to spell out for us that it was 17 years that Yaakov lived in Mitzrayim? In the Parfidige said, because we already know from Parshas Vayigash, as Komedik is in Mitzrayim is given, that by the time Yaakov got to Mitzrayim, how old was he? As he tells Paro himself, 130 years. That's how old he was, 130 years. When in Pasuk Gufa sagt die Torah, and in our Pasuk, in the beginning of Vayechi, the Torah tells us, Vayehi Yemei Yaakov Shnei Chayev Sheva Shanim Ba'boim U'Me'as Shana, that Yaakov lived 147 years. So he arrived in Mitzrayim at 130, he lived 147. It's not higher grade arithmetic. So you could work out that he lived for 17 years in Mitzrayim. So why then does the Torah feel it necessary to spell out for us how long Yaakov lived in Mitzrayim, as if we couldn't work it out? And on the other hand, let's say that it is important. We have to know that he lived for 17 years in Mitzrayim. Okay, so then, fine, then tell us that, and you don't have to tell us his total age. Again, we know from Parshas Vayigash that he arrived in Mitzrayim at the age of 130. So you tell me he arrived at 130, tell me he lived in Mitzrayim for 17 years, you don't have to tell me he was 147 when he passed away. It's self-understood. So it is strange that we're getting both the information of his total years and the information of how old he was when he arrived in Mitzrayim and how many years he lived in Mitzrayim. So many different commentaries point out, as the Pfarrer tellt die Torah ist die Zoljoren, was Yaakov hat gewohnt in Mitzrayim, sagt der Ruf Vayechi. So the commentaries tell us that this is the point. We need to know that when Yaakov was in Mitzrayim, that's the Vayechi. Those are his good years. But the Kuflamet Shana bis demelt, because the 130 years preceding that, as Yaakov himself tells Paroi, seien bei Yaakov nicht gewinn gerechnet für Jahren von Leben. They were not considered years of real life. And the time is, why not? Because they were difficult years. Filled with a lot of very difficult experiences and a lot of personal anxiety or despair or trauma. First, he had to escape his own brother Esav, who wanted to kill him. Then, the 2 decades at Lavan, where he was consumed by heat during the day and cold at night, and he never got to sleep, and he was, of course, misled by his father-in-law consistently. Of course, the highest trauma of his life was when Yosef was sold, and he was told that he had actually died. But once Yaakov comes to Mitzrayim, those 17 years, that's life, because there he has no trauma, no stress, no issues, no difficulties. He lived a peaceful life in the best area of the whole of Mitzrayim. Seeing his entire family all keeping the faith. On Yosef als Mishnah Lemelech, and Yosef is the powerhouse running Mitzrayim. The Pharisees given Vayechi Yaakov. So all the Meforshim tell us that's what the Torah wants us to know. Those 17 years, that was life. That's when he lived fully. Und die Torah ist kel alle seine Jahre zusammen in einem Sachakel von der Kufmem sein Shana. But then, here's where it gets interesting. After the Torah tells us that the 17 best years that Yaakov had were in Mitzrayim, then it tells us the total of 147 years. Bichdei onzudeuten damit as die letzte 17 gute Jahren, die Vayechi Jahren, to tell us that those last 17 years were so beautiful and so powerful, haben gemacht vergessen dem Zarn agmas nefesh von die alle friedige Jahren seine. They literally deleted all of the trauma, removed all of the difficulty of the preceding 130 years. That's how good his life was. To borrow a phrase from Chayei Sarah, it was so powerful, the time that he spent in Mitzrayim, that it made retroactively as if his entire life had been good. Now that's something we have to understand, because there must be more to the story. It's not just simply that you have such a great life that you forget your previous traumas. It must be more than that as well. So Saber noch als nicht glattig, which it's not 100% clear and smooth. As wie bald der letzte Jahren seine Gewinn betäuber, haben sie Jakob so vergittigt, wie zu machen, vergessen die Sünden von alle friedliche Jahren. Okay, so you could argue that Yaakov's good years in Mitzrayim were so beautiful and amazing that they made him forget how bad it had been before. But wie kann man aber Mosef sein asach hakol? That's fine and that's true, but how can you now take all 147 years and put them into one reality and say that was is bavus menit kidei tzmat gesehen as kulan shavin und nachmal kulan shavin letova. So what are you saying? You're saying that there's a theme, there's a common denominator between all of his years, that they were all good. How can you say that? When we know that 130 years of his life were difficult. Und die 17 Jahre seine Gewinn Vayechi tachlis achayim v'atoiv, and only 17 were amazing years. So how do you actually explain this? That the 17 years not just compensate for, or even create a sense of relief, but how can you say that those 17 years now come to define the 130 years that preceded them that were full of major challenges? So to understand that, we're going to look at this unusual reality that usually a parasha has a gap between the end of one parasha and the beginning of the next. Yet when it comes to Vayechi, there's no spacing. And there are various reasons given for that. So to explain how the 17 years in Mitzrayim could have absolved and uplifted and reconstituted the 130 traumatic years of Yaakov's life, we'll look at what Rashi and the Medrash both say at the beginning of the parasha. The Medrash, let's start with the Medrash. The Medrash is going to give us 3 reasons why there's no gap before the parasha Vayechi starts. Rashi will leave off one of those reasons, and we'll have to understand why. So the Medrash says, Lama parasha zeh stume mikola parasha shel Torah. How come it is that every parasha in the Torah usually has an opening blank space before the parasha begins, and not this one? Elo tells us the following reasons. Reason number 1 is because this is the parasha where Yaakov passes away, so life became difficult for the Jewish people. It's like things closed in on them, like this parasha is closed. Dovar acher, alternatively, lama hu stuma. Why is this parasha closed? Because Yaakov intended to share with his children the end of time, in other words, the date of Moshiach's arrival, and it was closed. He couldn't recall it. Or alternatively, alternatively, why is this parasha closed? Because Hashem now closed off all of the difficulties that Yaakov had experienced until this point in time, and they all disappeared. So let's understand the question first, and then the answers of the Medrash, and see how Rashi tackles it. Why are we asking the question, why is this parasha closed? Because b'pshutei shel mikra, if you take a simple understanding of how you read Torah, the fact that the Torah is designed in such a way that there's no blank space before these key words, Vayechi Yaakov, which indicate the new parasha, right? You're starting a new section, you would expect to have that gap, that open gap, so to speak. It's verstandig as do, so it's understood that over here, wie bei allen anderen Sedus von der Torah, just like with every other parasha, you expect a gap before the parasha begins. Why is it not there? Simple question. Everybody could relate to the question, and we need an answer. Pianal is in dem nicht verstandig. The only problem is, a couple of questions. Number one, die Stimme von der Welt Vayechi Yaakov hat der zum Menschen gedarft andeuten auf Stimme mal Yusa, was Vayechi Yaakov hat Gerim given. Okay, so there's no gap, right? There's no gap before the words Vayechi Yaakov. You would expect that the first thing the Torah is trying to tell us over here is something positive. Something positive occurs at this point in time, because look at the words Vayechi Yaakov. Something positive happens. Yaakov has good life. Which means that the first thing the Medrash should have said is, why is there a closed parasha? Because Hashem sealed off all of the difficulties that had assailed Yaakov for all of those years. That's what it should have been. Why do you start first by saying, no, it's because Yaakov passed away and now things are going to be bad for the Jews? But the theme is Vayechi. It's supposed to be a positive time, positive message. Noch starke is the Shaila. The question's even beyond that. Because euch far der Stimme, before we get to this piece of Vayechi Yaakov, the Sim from Parashas Vayigash, der zählt wegen dem guten Matzavachayim von Bnei Yisrael in Eretz Goshen. The previous Parasha Vayigash concluded on a very positive note about how good life was for Yaakov's family in Goshen. Es gewinnen an Eufen von Vayifru Vayirbu Bima'oid. It's a story of them growing and succeeding greatly. Es beschas as gleich noch dem onshum hefsek der zelt der Pasuk Vayechi Yaakov Eretz Mitzrayim Gomer. If you come straight from that story about how well the Bnei Yaakov, Bnei Yisrael are doing in Goshen, and now you go to Vayechi Yaakov, that he's going to live his best life, and there's no gap. Ist doch die Sforim Mechai, was mit der Stimme meint die Teure zum Madgestein, als Vayechi Yaakov kommt bis Smichus an kem hefsek in sein Teuchen, hat Teuch mit Sieben for the Friedige Parasha. Logic then says, well, the Torah wants you to know we're going straight from a positive message of Vayir bim oid to Vayechi Yaakov. Svavos kommt der Time von Sosen Menakot Sorshe Be'ilam im Medrash als letzter von die Timim. So why then does the Medrash list the reason why the parasha is closed? Because Yaakov's tzoros was sealed off. Why is that the last message? It should have been the first. Und die erst, das heißt, ikke dicke Timim, and the first reasons the Medrash gives, which always implies that they're the most central reasons, I've stimmes haparsha about why there's this lack of blank space, seinen Gorinonibus, seinen Hefech von Vayifru, Vayechi Yaakov Eretz Mitzrayim, are messages that are opposite of the good message of the end of Vayigash, and opposite of the good message of Vayechi, that this is Yaakov's best years. Doesn't make sense. The Medrash should have identified, according to Pshat, you go straight from a good news story to a good news story, so therefore the fact that there's no gap must be a good news story. Why do you leave that to offering or option number 3? This question is even larger when you look at Rashi's commentary. We know that Rashi's intention is always to explain the simplest understanding of the psukim. So how should Rashi have approached why there's no gap between Vayigash and Vayechi? According to Pshat, which means was direkt ist ein Indien Teuven Scheiches zu Vayifru Gomer und zu Chaye Yaakov Kenal. According to Pshat, and that's Rashi's game, Vayigash is a positive message, Vayechi is a positive message. The lack of spacing between them should surely highlight the positive message. Rashi should definitely not be looking for an interpretation that has a negative connotation if the flow in Pshat is positive. They are living a good life, Yaakov lives a good life. Why then would Rashi straight away go to negative outcomes from the fact that Yaakov passed away? So he's not moving, it doesn't make any sense. That third explanation the Medrash gives, that there's no gap in the parasha because Hashem had closed off Yaakov's tzoros, right? Amnensen to Pashtam Mikro, which is the one that's closest to the simple understanding of the pasuk, bring nit Rashi. Rashi does not quote it at all. How does that happen? The simplest understanding of the psukim is we're in a good space now, and Rashi does not quote at all the interpretation that there's no gap between Vayigash and Vayechi because it's a good space. Even the two other explanations the Medrash offers. Was Rashi bringt hier, which Rashi does quote, at the very least Rashi should have offered them in the opposite order to how he does. Leuten, zweiten Time ist die Stimme verbunden mit Chaye Yaakov. The second explanation is linked to Yaakov's life. So yes, of course, the reason he wanted to tell his children about the coming of Mashiach is because he's about to pass away. Fine, but but at least chronologically, it's while he's still alive, should be the first thing you mention. Yet the first explanation Rashi talks about is how the Golus began after Yaakov passes away. So what would prompt Rashi to present in these two explanations in a non-chronological order? Aber frat, als ich die Inyan loi toiv, is da noch mehr harve leuten zweiten time. And especially the fact that he couldn't tell them when Mashiach's going to come. Okay, bad news. But it's not nearly as bad as saying the Golus is going to begin. So why does Rashi leave out the good news completely, then go straight to the worst news, which is chronologically later in the story, and then come back chronologically to something which happened earlier and is not as serious? It really doesn't make sense. So wenn man das verstehen, like dem, was wir forschen, vereinfachen die Kasche auf die zwei Time. So let's start off first by examining what various commentators point out about another question, or about the question, with regards to these two reasons. The time for Stimas HaParsha is the Fisher Kamish and if the Yaakov Avinu Nistam Uchulei. Let's say that the reason there's no gap between Vayigash and Vayechi is because Yaakov passed away and basically life closed off for the Jewish people and Golus began. Or if you want to say the other reason, which is that Yaakov wanted to share the end of times and he wasn't able to, either one of them would have only really made sense later on in the parasha, and that's where there should be no gap. It should have been at the time where Yaakov wanted to bless his children, because that's when he was unable, he was blocked from sharing when Mashiach's coming. Or it should have been at the time where Yaakov passes away. That's where there should be no gap. So that's a great question. Why, if it's true what Rashi is saying, that the reason there's no gap between Vayigash and Vayechi relates to either just before or just after Yaakov's passing, then this lack of spacing should have been in the part of the parasha that's about Yaakov's passing, either just before or just after. Answer the Meforshim u'mefein fetazastime mitten seders nit can take that kegen in onhoip sedra. So they say, well, there's a very obvious reason for that. You wouldn't notice it in the middle of the parasha. That's common. But when you have no gap between the end of one parasha and the beginning of the next, that is very glaring, and so it's going to draw your attention. Shah system is in onhoip sedra. Here's the logic. When you have no gap at the beginning of a parasha, because you expect that a new parasha means new topic, and therefore darf doch sein a hefsek revach mer vi al derech harogil. So that's the place you really expect to have an opening, to have a blank space. So where you expect to find a gap, when you now discover there is none, and you've got two separate parashas without a break between them, so now you have to realize, look, this is obviously not the parasha trying to draw our attention to the fact that some detail in the parasha has to be taught in the context of stima, that something closes. No, es ist verbunden mit Klolos Teichen HaSedra. The fact that this lack of spacing is right at the beginning of the parasha must inform our understanding of the entire parasha. On the far words in Nirmas Batur Akdama to the Teichen HaSedra Uchide Lahalon, which basically means that the fact that there's no gap between Vayigash and Vayechi is actually the intro to Parashas Vayechi, as we shall see. So, if you want to now understand what is the reason there's no gap between Vayigash and Vayechi, you have to ask yourself, what is the primary theme of Parashas Vayechi? Well, that's obvious. Parashas Vayechi is not the details of how Yaakov lived those brilliant 17 years in Mitzrayim, because those wird erzählt in Parashas Vayigash. That's already described in the preceding parasha. As Yaakov avonim seinen gewinne meitav ha'oretz, the fact that they lived in the best part of Mitzrayim, until we see that the Torah tells us they had immense success and growth. So what does Vayechi talk about? The entire theme of Vayechi is those things that led up to Yaakov's passing and the story of his passing. Von Vayikrevu Yemei Yisrael Lamus in Onfang Parasha. The beginning of the parasha tells us Yaakov was drawing to the end of his days, and therefore he wanted to bless his children and grandchildren. Und der Hemshach Yinone wegen Yaakov Avinu's Brachas to Yosef Vanov und danach die Bracha Levanov. Right, the brachas to Ephraim and Menashe, and then the brachas to the Shvatim. That's all, of course, related to the time immediately before Yaakov's passing. The good years, last week's parasha. Especially when you consider that right at the beginning of the parasha, in the ersten pasuk, the very first pasuk does what? It tells us the total sum of how many years Yaakov lived. Well, that tells you, obviously, that we're at the end of his life. So Vayigash is the part of the Torah that talks about the good years of Yaakov's life in the 17 years in Mitzrayim. Vayechi talks about the end of his life. Is davon verstandig? So that's the theme of Vayechi. So now we can conclude, as mit der Parasha Stuma, the fact that there's no gap between Vayigash and Vayechi, which is now supposed to represent an intro to Parashas Vayechi, meint die Torah ondait nefastime bekeshet zum Teichen kloli von der Parasha Petiras Yaakov. The Torah is obviously alluding to the fact that something is closed or hidden or concealed. Where or about what? About Yaakov's passing, not about Yaakov's life. That's actually the pshat. This will help us understand why Rashi leans towards finding reasons that have to do with Yaakov's passing, not with the good years or the end of his tzoros, because the logic says the parasha of Vayechi is about Yaakov's passing. This is the introduction to the parasha of Vayechi. It must be linked to his passing. Dermit wird vereinfacht beide in der Montekashis, which answers the two questions. Was Rashi is mashmit in dritten tam, why Rashi doesn't talk at all about how the closed parasha represents that Hashem sealed off Yaakov's tzoros. On the Seder von der zweite gebrachte Taimim, and it also helps us resolve why Rashi presents the two reasons which he does quote in what we thought was the non-chronological order. What's Rashi thinking? Because we now know that the lack of spacing between Vayigash and Vayechi is supposed to relate to the whole theme of Vayechi, which is about Yaakov's passing. So the and whatever surrounded his passing hat bemele in pshutoy shel mikra kenordnit as die Stimme von der Seder was red wegen Petiras Yaakov. So it's quite obvious then that if this lack of space between Vayigash and Vayechi is somehow linked to the theme of Yaakov's passing, obviously it's not there to tell us, oh, Yaakov's tzoros stopped. They were hidden. They were closed off. That's got nothing to do with his passing. Science-man, is given bald beim Kommen in Mitzrayim 17 Jahre vor seinem Petira. First of all, it wouldn't make sense time-wise, because when did Yaakov's tzoros end? 17 years earlier than this parasha. This would not be the place that you alert us to it. And from a content perspective, the inyan von shesosam imenu kol tzoros shabaylam was is tachlis achayus. When you say that Yaakov had no more tzoros, you're telling me that Yaakov lived his best possible life. Is in Gegensatz zum Petira shel Yaakov. That's the exact opposite of saying Yaakov passes away. The Fall ist Rashi in ganzem Mash mit dem dritten Tam. That's why Rashi doesn't even consider including the third explanation, because it speaks about the good years of Yaakov's life, and the Stimas HaParsha is actually related to the end of Yaakov's life. And also, we can now understand why Rashi offers the suggestion that Yaakov wanted to reveal when Moshiach's coming and didn't. He puts that second. Why second? Because if it's the theme of the parasha is about Yaakov passing away, then if there is an explanation as to why there's no gap between Vayigash and Vayechi, and that explanation is tethered to Yaakov passing away, that's got to be the primary explanation. Because in that explanation, why is Sosam? Why is the parasha closed? Because now they're going into Golus, and life is going to, so to speak, close in on them as a direct result of Yaakov passing away. As opposed to the fact that Yaakov may have wanted to tell them when Mashiach's coming, and that was blocked from him. That's not directly related to Yaakov passing away. But we really need to understand this on a far deeper level. Es bleibt aber noch nicht verstandig b'pnimius ha'inyan. Let's try and understand this beyond just the simple connecting the dots of it's talking about Yaakov passing away, so obviously that must be why the parashas are closed. What does this all symbolize? So let's ask ourselves this question. Es bleibt aber noch nicht verstandig b'pnimius ha'inyan, favos hebt sich taka on die Seder mit Vayechi Yaakov. Okay, fine. So you've explained to me that Parashas Vayigash describes the 17 beautiful years that Yaakov had in Mitzrayim, and Vayechi talks about his passing. So then why do you call it Vayechi? The theme of the parasha is Yaakov passing away, and whatever led up to his passing and followed his passing. Yes, of course, when it's the time that he passes away, you kind of summarize his life and say, this is how long he lived. 147 years, wie gesagt früher, like earlier. Damit wird aber bloß recht die Scheiches vom zweiten halben Pasuk, weil hier in Yaakov Gomer. Fine, you could say that by using the second half of the Pasuk, which says Yaakov's total years were 147. Aber der erste halbe Pasuk, but the first part of the Pasuk, Vayechi Yaakov eres Mitzrayim 17 shana, that Yaakov lived to the hilt for 17 years in Mitzrayim. Wo es wird erzählt von Yaakov's beste Jahren, which describes Yaakov's best years ever. Was war a kishe hat es mit Petiras Yaakov? How does that connect to Yaakov passing away? In fact, logically, especially when you consider that there is no gap between Vayigash and Vayechi, this is how the parasha should have been split. The fact that Yaakov lived for 17 years in Mitzrayim, 17 best years, das hat gedacht sein, der Sim from Parashas Vayigash should have been the last pasuk of Parashas Vayigash, because you're ending the story of his good life. That's where the parasha tells us that he came back to life again. And everybody had tremendous success. And then to say, and Yaakov lived 147 years, that's how the next parasha should have begun. And instead of calling it Parashas Vayechi, we could have called it, I don't know, Parashas Vayehi Yemei Yaakov, or whatever. How does Vayechi belong in the parasha of his passing? Noch davon verstehen. Let's take it further. Take that concept further. Because one thing we know for sure, the names of parashas are not chosen randomly. We've discussed many times, the name of a parasha represents the theme of the parasha. And in der Zeit, was der Inhalt von der Seder ist Petiras Yaakov. How do you name a parasha Vayechi if the parasha is all about Yaakov passing away? Hefech von der Minyan von Vayechi, the exact opposite of the theme of Vayechi. Now, that question is actually the opener to the real understanding of what's going on over here. What does it mean to be alive? We throw around the term, obviously. We think living is that your heart beats and that you breathe. Not in Torah. The bir in them explanation is amitius in achaim is as achaim was is alamol chai. According to Torah, and this is an axiom, we have to remember how not to think like an ordinary person, but to think like a Jew. Alive means uninterrupted or unchanging life. Atakim nitzchi on shinuyim. It's eternal and it never shifts. Was der Fall ist der Emes Metzius von Chaim for Anor beim Eibeshen de Mekir Chaim, which is why the only entity that is truly alive is Hashem Himself, the source of all life, because Hashem doesn't change. Wie steht, Va'avai Elikim Emes Hu Elikim Chaim. The pasuk tells us because Hashem is true, therefore Hashem is alive. Was Emes is Azach, was wird nicht nifsek nishtane. True means it never changes. If something does temporarily cease, we call that in Torah false. Was der Fall findet man als Teichen, was werden ausgetrinkt einmal in 7 Jahren, wenn sogar von Naras und Mechazvin. That's why in Halacha, if you have a river that dries up, even if it's only once in 7 years, the halachic definition of such a river is false river. And you cannot use the water from that river for the mechatos, which is used in the process of the para aduma, because that has to be mayim chaim. It has to be living waters. Something is only truly alive. It is if it is alive consistently all the time, and that can only apply to Hashem. Und der Sagen Chazal, which is why the Chazal tell us as Chisomoy Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu Emes, that the signature, the symbol of Hashem is Emes. What represents Hashem? Absolute, unwavering, consistent truth. Emes is aufgestellt von drei Oisios. If you look at the word Emes, it's comprised of 3 letters. Aleph, the erste is von Aleph Beis. It starts with the first letter of the Aleph Beis. Then it has Mem, the mittelste Ois, the middle letter of the Aleph Beis, Mem. And then Tov, the letzte Ois, the last letter of the Aleph Beis. Was beweist, as there is on keine Shinuyim, Emes doesn't change. It's the same at the beginning as it is in the middle, as it will be at the end. Like the pasuk says, "Ani rishon v'ani achron u'miboladai en elikim." I am the beginning, I am the end. There's nothing else besides me. So, who is truth? Hashem. Who is alive? Hashem. Living does not simply mean you breathe. Living means you're truly alive. That's why the pasuk says, "Vaya Elikim." What is the nature of Hashem? Emes. The essence of Hashem is truth. It can never end, cease, pause, stop, change. Therefore, is who Elikim Chaim is Yisborach Emes and Metzius von Chaim. The Eibishter is the only real living entity, and we're not like that at all. Mashenke Nivroim. That's not the case for created beings. If you are created, you're not fundamentally, essentially alive. You're alive on the good graces of your Creator. If you're created, that means that you are bound by the laws of entropy, and you're on the way to disappearing. And Hashem has to keep you alive. So a created being cannot be truly alive. We need to be plugged in. We need a source, and that source has to feed our life at any given time. And like this, it could change. The only way that you could be truly alive is if you are truly connected to Hashem. Vayechi Yaakov. What does it mean to be truly alive? How are you truly alive? Connected to Hashem. That's why generically the Jewish people are called alive. As we're going to see now. And of course, because we're connected to Hashem, as the pasuk tells us, you who are connected to Hashem today, you are truly alive. We, because of our connection to Hashem, can be truly alive, and eternally so. And eternal is going to be a big part of our theme in this conversation. Okay, so deep down at a neshama level, we're absolutely alive because we're absolutely connected to Hashem, and the soul is eternal. But in order to see and experience that here on earth, in our physical world, which is designed to conceal the truth of Hashem's reality, how do you see in this world that you're really alive? It's by Dafka going through challenges, distractions, concealment. And then, und doch bleibt der ganze umgeändert in Kimatero Mitzvahs. If you go through all the bumps along the way and you still remain completely dedicated to your connection to Hashem, then we know you're alive. Demult wird neskale mit der voller Klarkeit sein Emes Echayes, was entwickelt wird, kann nicht geändert werden. Because now we see, you're not connected to Hashem in a relationship of convenience, in a relationship of inspiration. You've been through the mill, you've had the rough times, you've had the disappointments, you've had the darkness, and you're still connected to Hashem. Now we know that you're truly alive. Now we know that your connection is real. And that's why Vayechi Yaakov applies not just to the good years that Yaakov had in Mitzrayim, 17 years, but specifically to the Vayechi message where he passes away. In fact, that's why the whole parasha is called Vayechi. Why? Because during all of those 130 previous years, Vayechi, it wasn't yet possible to see if Yaakov Avinu's life with God, living his Judaism, was truly alive. In fact, we couldn't necessarily detect that Yaakov was living at that heightened level of connection to Hashem reserved for the Avos, where they are like this vehicle just simply to express godliness in the world. Because the Mishnah Pirkei Avos tells us, don't trust yourself until your last day. The Gemara tells us even a tzaddik has to be wary of this and not think that they have made or achieved whatever it is that they're supposed to achieve in connection to Hashem until the end. We already know from Parshas Vayechi that Yaakov consistently was concerned. What if I have done something that lacks in my service of Hashem, and due to that, I'm not as good as I should be? Und der Pfarrer ist sein Tage von Wegsix. Von alle Jahren in Eretz Yisrael. So now, all the time that you had this connection between Yaakov and Hashem, even while he was in Eretz Yisrael, und das Durchgehen also viel Tzaros and Yisurim, the fact that he went through so many difficulties and traumas. All of that, as beautiful as it is, as much of a stalwart of Judaism Yaakov was, we still don't know that it's Chaim Amitiyim, that he's truly, truly alive. Und afilo ich nicht das, was hat gesehen, als seine Kinder bnei Bonn auf seinen Tzadikim. Even the fact that Yaakov had the satisfaction of knowing that the next generation, his children, and their children, like we see with Ephraim and Menashe, were completely dedicated. They were tzadikim. Bald haben sich gefunden in Eretz Yisrael, wir können nicht wissen, wie sehr Matzav kann sein in ein vergräbtes Land. Sorry, not talking about Ephraim and Menashe, we'll get there soon. But the children that he saw in Eretz Yisrael, they were in a pristine environment. They were in a protected environment. We don't yet know. We don't yet know how you face off in the most challenging situation. But in our parsha where Yaakov is now at the end of his life, right? He's there. He's at the end of his life. And what happened before this point? He arrived in Mitzrayim. Is given to kommen und überzeugen sich als euch wohendigen Erwas ha'oretz is beschlemes hoch hineilen kim atera mitzvahs be the letzte Regel von sein Leben. And now he knows with confidence he's in the worst spot on earth. Mitzrayim, Erwas ha'oretz, the most lowly, promiscuous land, and he's 100% focused, dedicated, on point. Befrat noch beim Zen dort as mitos schlemen. And then especially seeing that in Mitzrayim his family is still whole. As alle seine Kinder seinen ganzen Zer Tzidkes, which means that all of his children and descendants are completely dedicated to Hashem. Und euch Yosef, including Yosef, nicht gucken was Melech hu, besides the fact that he is the king in Mitzrayim, und nicht ben Agoyim, and he had been captured and therefore in a sense assimilated within the nations of the world for a long time. He remained absolutely righteous. Bis Menashe Ephraim, to the point that even Menashe and Ephraim was geboren geworden in Mitzrayim Erbasoretz, who didn't know another life. They were born into that horrible, toxic environment. Seinen Rolle bruch? They still deserve brachas. And if so viel as in Bechaladoros when sich benchen mit sei Simchelikim Ephraim Menashe, not only did they deserve Yaakov's brachas, but that bracha becomes the hallmark bracha that we give our children still till today. Das dort Megalle given Yaakov's Emerson Chayus only after having that ultimate test, then you could see that Yaakov is truly alive. As euch alle seine friedliche Jahren, which reflects back on even the previous years, when Hagam B'chitzenes full mit Yisurim and Agmas Nefesh, you look back at those 130 years and think, oi, Nebuch, poor guy. Look what a terrible life he had. So much trauma, so much stress, so much conflict. Seine Bepnimius given Vayechi Yaakov, I can now with retrospect look back and say, Yaakov was truly alive through all of that. He was really alive. Und fahrt an die letzte 17 Jahre in Mitzrayim a klare Beweis as Kulon Shavin Letova, which is why the last 17 years in Mitzrayim are not the good years. They're the symbol of all his years having been good. That he could live in Mitzrayim with that heightened level of absolute commitment to Hashem reflects back on his entire life that it was that way. Damit is was is said of Vayechi. That explains why the parasha is called Vayechi. Hagam as in Retzich nit nor wegen dem Urois von Yaakov Samuch lipti Rasai, even though you'll say, how could this be Vayechi? It's the tail end of his life. Nor euch ptiras Yaakov, and the actual passing. Wegen dem Zman was nach dem, and the immediate next stage of history. How could you say Vayechi and then talk about him passing away? Famously, the Gemara sagt, we all know the Gemara that tells us, as Yaakov Avinu lo meis, that Yaakov did not die. Ma zar oi b'chaim afu b'chaim, just as his descendants are alive, so is he. On the Farah steht nicht by Yaakov and the Lashon Misa, that's why you look in the Torah, it doesn't say anything about Vayomos, that he passed away. But the Pirush Defon is, what do you mean that he's alive? It means the emes chaim von Yaakov steht in dem was zar oi b'chaim. That means not just that he is alive, but it means that the nature of his life is such that it's reflected in the ongoing commitment and living as Jews of his children. Das heißt, in other words, Yois says the emes inyan for chaim is das was das is nitzchizdik un kaim la'ad. We already said before, what does it mean to be alive? To be alive means without interruption, without diversion, without pause. Which is pretty much what you find that the Eibishter has. The Eibishter doesn't change, doesn't shift, doesn't diminish, doesn't pause. And we're all connected to Hashem. Der Rebbe setzt sich an der Emes Chaim von Yaakov Dafke, wenn man sieht die Nitzchizdigkeit der Funds. How do you know Yaakov is alive? Because it doesn't pause. It doesn't disappear after he physically leaves. Nachdem wie die Neshama geht weg vom Guf. Even after his Neshama leaves his body, his life continues. Das meint, as nicht nur der Chayes und Weikes bleibt nitzchizdig in Chaye HaNeshama. It wouldn't be a big surprise to us if you told me that Yaakov's Neshama lives on. Obviously, all Neshamas live on. The Chiddush is that here in this physical, real world, that's where you see bleibt der emes chayos von Yaakov, and you see Yaakov's living is alive in this world. In seine Kinder, it's reflected in his children, as they live in dem emes chaim von Yaakov Avinu, that they live the same life, passion, connection that Yaakov lived. That's called alive. Because alive means it never stops. And if Yaakov leaves the room and it still continues, then you know he's alive. And that's a beautiful explanation why we call this parasha Vayechi. Not just to tell us that Yaakov lived a brilliant life and now we see it. Damit is nicht bloß mutgesch as eich lachrei ptiris Yaakov is noch halt shaykh zu sagen Vayechi Yaakov. By calling this parasha Vayechi, firstly we say that even after Yaakov passes away, you could still use the word that he's alive. But no nochmer, it's much more than that. Dafka demult. You dafka after Yaakov physically passes, now's when you begin to realize how alive he is. When he's a living human, okay, we know many of those. And we don't necessarily see the uniqueness of Yaakov that he's alive, because he's passionate, yes, he's connected, yes. When do you see the real nitzchios, the eternity of Yaakov Avinu's life? After he passes away. Now we said earlier on in the Sikha that the lack of spacing between Vayigash and Vayechi is not just about the words, even the words Vayechi Yaakov, but it's about the entire message of the entire parasha. And we identified what is the theme of the entire parasha, everything to do with Yaakov's passing. Is Rashi mashmet in written time for Medrash Shasam Menachot Tzara Shaboilam. Now we can really understand and appreciate why Rashi did not quote the explanation that the lack of spacing is to teach us that Yaakov's tzoros ended. Und bringt bloß die zwei Times Shenifte Yaakov und Shebikash Legalis as Aketz Levona Venista Mimeno. And he only quotes that either the parasha is closed because now life started to close in on the Jews because Yaakov passed away and they went into Galus, or because the information was closed off from Yaakov and he could not tell his children when Mashiach is coming. Either way, Yaakov, Rashi insisted on using commentary that is specifically linked to Yaakov passing away. So far, we only explained that really in a simple pshat level, that it makes sense. The theme of the parasha is about Yaakov's passing, so Rashi will use the explanations that are linked to his passing. But on a deeper level, it's a very beautiful geschmack insight. Mit dem, was Dafka die Seder from Ptiris Yaakov wird angerufen, Vayechi. The fact that Dafka, this parasha, the parasha that describes Yaakov passing, this is the one that's called Vayechi. Warum Dafka durch die zwei Parushim wird herausgebracht und unterstrichen. These two explanations, that either Yaakov passed away and now the Golus began, or that Yaakov could not reveal the time of Mashiach, they both illustrate and highlight, as the Amitis Achaim is Nimshach Yevoren Eich Bebonov, they both highlight how Yaakov's life is alive dafka because it continues into his children. As Emes 11 begolis given the Inyan from Kim Ater Mitzvahs Dveikos in Elikus, because it illustrates to us that life for Yaakov is not just breathing. Life for Yaakov is complete connection to Torah and mitzvahs. Let's understand how that is. And this has a very directly relevant lesson for all of us in our personal situation. If you're going to tell me that people learn Torah and do mitzvahs in times that are good, it's nikin greis achidish. No big surprise. Noch mehr. Viele wenn Eden hitten up Torah mitzvahs sein dik in Golus, and even if Jews do fulfill Torah mitzvahs in difficult times in Golus, but it's a kind of Golus where you can see the end. You can see the light at the end of the tunnel. You can see the way out. Like Golus Bavel, you know it's going to be 70 years and then it's over. Or there are signs that life is not so challenging. Or we have somehow in our minds, we know when it's all going to conclude. Okay. That still means that the Jews are doing what they should. It's not necessarily an indicator that they live what they should be doing. But when you're in a situation where the Golus is so overwhelming, what does it mean, so overwhelming? Which means the human mind cannot see a way out. Nistam aketz. The possibility of an end period is blocked. It sounds impossible. We thought it didn't happen. The world's just getting worse. If in those circumstances you retain absolute faith that Mashiach will come, to the extent that you wait every day with anticipation, should be today. And not just that you wait in some kind of nebulous way, but in that difficulty. We learn Torah, we fulfill mitzvahs. That is a compelling illustration of what? A Jew's life is Torah and mitzvahs. How do I know? Because when life is incredibly difficult, I'm still connected to Torah and mitzvahs. I don't wait just for the good times. That would express Yaakov's life for real. Because as we already said, how is Yaakov alive? When his children are alive. Vayechi Yaakov. When are his children alive? Not in the good times. That's not called alive. That's called freewheeling. When are you alive? In the time where you feel all hope is lost, where you feel it's completely overwhelming, it's no longer popular, everybody calls you some kind of an extremist because of the Judaism that you want to practice, and you're still alive, and you're still committed. Then you're alive. Damit wird doch besser verstanden, was Rashi bringt bloß die erste zwei Time nicht in Tam von Shesosim in a Kotzer Boilam. Now this gives us a totally profound insight into why Rashi only brings the other explanations and Dafka not the explanation. that it's the end of the tzoros in Yaakov's life. Because if the no spacing between Vayigash and Vayechi was specifically about the fact that the tzoros are gone, then I don't know that we're really committed to Judaism. We're just living an easy and good life. We don't know that we're really alive. Der Emes Vayechi wird nisgale in der Avoide, in dem Zman von Tzoras, Hashibud und Stimas Haketz. Where do you see that you're really alive? In the tough times. In the times where Mashiach is invisible. In the times where it feels like there's no way out. Undemult. Wenn der Vayechi von Torah Mitzvahs tut sich auf euch in Zman von Golus v'Shibud. So when, in fact, our connection to Torah Mitzvahs, our observance, our commitment to Torah Mitzvahs is even in the toughest of times, then wird nisgale die Kavona Pnimis in the Tachlis von dem Golus and Tzoras Hashibud. That automatically unveils, reveals why they are tough times, why there is Golus in the first place. As dafka durch dem kommt men zu die Giluim von der Geula betachlis hashleimus. Why is there Golus? Not to punish us, not to make life difficult, not to create stress, not to create trauma, not to create 130 years of Yaakov's difficulty. It's all just for one reason, Vayechi Yaakov. That we could live Torah mitzvahs properly and thereby reveal Geula in this world. And that also helps us to appreciate why one of the explanations is that Yaakov couldn't tell them when Mashiach is coming. This is the deeper reason why suddenly Yaakov went blank at exactly the moment he was going to tell his children the good news, Mashiach's arriving at such and such a date. It disappeared. Why? Let's assume that Yaakov had shared that information. Then the overwhelming experience of Golus wouldn't be so overwhelming because we'd know the time frame. Even if it's a long time away, there's a certain calm, there's a certain comfort in knowing that there is an end. And if the Golus is not a full experience of Golus, then the Geula that follows is not a full experience of Geula. By the way, Rashi goes, he illustrates this by telling us information that theoretically he didn't have to tell us. What does he tell us? Yaakov wanted to reveal the Kate and it was hidden from him. Why do you have to tell me that? What's Rashi looking to explain? Why there's no gap in the script between Vayigash and Vayechi. Why it's a closed parasha. It's a closed parasha because the information was closed off from Yaakov. That's all. Why is it relevant for Rashi to tell us Yaakov wanted to reveal the end of times and it was hidden from him? Just say simply, the end of times was hidden from him. Not in them is merumas. Rashi wants to hint as aderabba. That's actually the whole point. Specifically because Yaakov could not recall the information he wanted to share. That actually fulfilled his intention, which was to reveal the end of time to his children. How so? Because the fact that Hashem would not allow him to know at that moment and therefore share at that moment the awareness of when Moshiach is coming, it's not because Hashem was trying to be difficult or hide things from him. No, the tachlis is birdeas durch Irzel spetal ariskom de gile aketz kenal. It's because the Eibishter wanted to empower us that we would reveal Mashiach through our efforts, and our efforts are only at full throttle if we don't know the end time. That's the meaning of the pasuk that Yaakov wanted to reveal the Geula to his children, and therefore it was hidden from him. When Yaakov wanted to bring to and share with his descendants, his children, the story of Mashiach, the opportunity for Mashiach, is in order that his children should have access to the Geula in the fullest sense, is given stimas haketz. To facilitate that, he had to lose sight of when the time frame is. das gibt mit Achone. That was the preparation, as dennoch sollen sie mekabel sein, das was Bikesh Yaakov the Galois, die Geuluyim von die Geula Hoasida, and that opened the path for Yaakov to share with his children the means by which they would reveal Moshiach. So Vayechi Yaakov, yes, it's a story of Yaakov passing away, but it's really the story of how Yaakov lives for real, even when he is not present. Why? Because the values he passes on to his children, they live even when it's not comfortable. And by doing so, we are able to bring about the coming of Moshiach in Yitz Hashem right now.